Hello, my friends. Manny Rodriguez coming back at you with another episode of Going Deep in True Crime. Today's story is one that is a horrific story. One that I will have to share. Viewer discretion is advised because there are going to probably be some trigger moments for people who have been through traumatic experiences. To people who may not be able to take such horrific stories very well. And as someone who wishes they became a detective, I can tell you, blood I'm not good with. I cannot handle blood. And I know that is one thing that would have always kept me from being a detective. I was watching a movie last night. It was called Spiral. And let me tell you, I could not watch the traumatic scenes, the most disgusting ones. I struggle with that. I will share that with you. I can share a story like this and share the horrific moments, but don't let me look at the scene, right? That's where I struggle with. And so we start here at when police are called to 4315 Charlotte Street in Kansas City, Missouri. Chris BRYSON had just jumped from the second story of this house that you're looking at on the screen. And this happened on April 2nd, 1988. This is over Easter weekend. And Chris BRYSON, who was 22 years old at the time, he jumped from this house on Charlotte Street and he was gone. He was doing everything he can to get away from that house. All he was wearing was a dog collar. That's it. And so, of course, the police are going to want to interview him, and he shares with them the 4 days of torture he went through in that house. The sodomizing he went through, the terror that he went through at the hands of Robert Berdella, who was 39 years old at that time. Now, although Chris was bruised, he was drugged up, he was abused in many ways, he was held hostage, he was held against his will, but he was luckier than 6 other deaths that occurred in that same home. So it's pretty obvious, had he not gotten away, number one, this would have continued to happen to others. Number 2, who knows when they would have caught this guy? And so that's exactly who we're going to be talking about today. The horrific killings from Robert Berdella. And he's also known as the Kansas City Butcher. And he's also known as the Collector. The reason why they named him the Collector, and he shares this, and I'll talk about this a little more later, but he watched the movie when he was younger called The Collector, which is exactly what he did, where he was holding people against their will. In the movie, a man held a woman against her will and he hurt her. And that's exactly what he was doing to these people. So it seems fitting that they would give him such a nickname based off of a movie that stuck with him. And he says that this movie stuck with him for a long time. And so it's clear that some of this has something to do with what has occurred in his world. And where does the Kansas City Butcher nickname come from? Well, what does a butcher do? Chops things up, right? Chops meat up. Well, Robert Berdella, he chopped up his victims. He left them into little pieces, stuffed them in a dog food bag, and trashed them. And truth is, had it not been for his little journalistic notes, the cops may have never caught up to this guy. Or at least never been able to put him away with so much evidence against 6 victims. Thanks to Chris for gaining his trust, for gaining Robert's trust enough to put the handcuffs in front of him and giving him a way out and trusting him with the remote control while he left to go to work. Those are little instances where it was fortunate that Chris got away, that he could then share what was going on in this house. And it's well known that Berdella kept a journal, and he would shorthand a lot of his notes, like maybe 2 letters that meant 2 words. And he had more than 350 Polaroid photographs of his victims that they were able to follow his tracks on where these people were going and who the victims were. He made notes on a lot of different things, including the sexual positions that were including the victims and the different reactions to these. I mean, he was making notes of all of that. He was sharing the methods that he was using to punish his victims, like injecting drain cleaner into the voice box or caulking their ears shut. It was horrific what he was doing to these people, and he would note what he was doing, including the physical conditions of his victims, how they were responding to it. He even made a final notation for one victim. He just wrote down 86. Simply wrote 86. That was how he described the ending to one of his victims. As we get deeper into this story, I want to remind you, viewer discretion is advised because some of this is heinous and it's despicable in so many ways. And I want to let you know so you don't get caught off guard. This is not a pretty story. Obviously, whenever it comes to true crime, it can get ugly in many ways. But I thought in this particular case, I will put that warning out there because there's some gruesome details that are going to be coming up. So let's talk about who is Robert Berdella. Okay, who is this Kansas City butcher? Who is this the collector, as they refer to him as? Well, Robert was born in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. As you can see, north of Akron, Ohio. And throughout his time he was born there, he was raised there. He was born on January 31st of 1949. And he was the first of 2 sons born to Robert Berdella Sr. Again, Robert is the oldest. He's the firstborn. He's the first of 2 sons born. His other brother, his younger brother, who was about 7 years younger, his name is Daniel. And so they were both born to Robert and Mary Berdella. And Berdella's father, Robert's father, was a Catholic of Italian descent, and he raised his family in a deeply religious household. This was something that was very strong to Robert Sr. He truly believed in following this religious way through the Catholic way. And so they regularly attended Mass, and both sons went to religious education classes. And so his dad tried to raise them along the Catholic way, which at that time, I think a lot of people were Catholics. I was raised being told I was Catholic, even though I was never baptized in a Catholic church. How are you Catholic if you're not baptized in a Catholic church? I don't know. But I would later realize that no, Catholic is not the way for me, not the route that I want to follow when it comes to Christianity. And so as a child, Robert Jr., he was intelligent, but he was a loner. He didn't have many friends. He didn't have friends coming over and spending time at his house. He seldom had anyone coming over. He also had a speech impediment, and he wore thick glasses from the age of 5 because he was severely nearsighted. So, of course, things like this, you know how kids can be. And so that was one of those things that he was kind of bullied for when he was young. And he was diagnosed at a young age with high blood pressure. And so he took several medications. And, you know, he wasn't an athlete like his younger brother, Daniel. And, you know, his dad did not like the fact that he was not an athlete as Daniel was. And so this was something that his dad kind of held against him, being unathletic, not being there. And this is also part of probably why he didn't have many friends. He didn't go out there and he didn't socialize with many friends. And so this was also another thing that kind of might have weighed on Robert Berdella Jr.'s world. Now, Robert's father would physically and emotionally abuse both Daniel and Robert and beat them with a leather strap. When Robert reached puberty, he started to realize that he was gay. He liked boys. He liked the same sex as he was. And during these times, that's not something that you can really be open with. I could remember growing up in New York City in the 80s to early 90s, and my mom being a lesbian. May she rest in peace now, but being a lesbian as a child, I can tell you that was very weird to watch her kiss another female, because that's not what we grew up at that time knowing. Now granted, things are totally different nowadays, but back then and in his case, he was even younger, so though that's become much more acceptable nowadays, decades ago that was hard to accept. So it was hard for him to be open about such a thing, because he knew that was not widely accepted and he would probably be shunned, especially being raised in a religious household. And even part of this, though he realized he was homosexual, he also had a girlfriend because he did not want it to be known. He was trying to fight this off. And so because it wasn't widely accepted, he went where, most people were going then. He tried to be a straight male. Now, by his mid-teens, Robert Berdella Jr. started to display a little bit of self-confidence. And you can tell by the way he started talking to people. He was more confident, but he also brought more attitude towards other individuals, and he would show a lot of rudeness and a condescending attitude, and really towards women, a lot towards women. They started noticing this, and he started learning about cooking and art and developed showmanship, and so he was starting to develop into his own personality. Now on Christmas Day in 1965, him and his family were driving to Canton, Ohio to visit relatives for the holidays. Here it is. It's Christmas, right? That evening on Christmas, his dad, senior, that had a heart attack. So his dad died at 39 years old, which is pretty young to die and still have a teenager at home, and even younger with Daniel, who was like maybe less than 10 years old at this time. 2 days after Christmas, when he actually finds out that his dad is officially dead, he didn't take it too well. He did not take it too well, and he started trying to find comfort in religion, and he started reading many different faiths to see which route that he should be going in. And what he found was that he became cynical towards all of this religion, and he just didn't believe. He just started thinking, well, if this happened and this happened, there can be this. He started reading too much into things the wrong way. And this is where in 1965, while he's still young, he watches the movie The Collector. As I mentioned earlier, this is where he gets one of his nicknames from. And the plot of the movie, this completely revolves around a man who stalks and holds captive a woman. And this woman, he finds her attractive, and in the movie he holds her captive in a place that has no windows, a stone basement, you know, viewing her as little more than an attractive specimen. And so this is part of that movie, right? So after a few weeks, the woman dies of a contracted illness despite her captor's effort to keep her alive. Berdella later shared that the movie had formed a lasting impression on him. Now, shortly after Robert Sr.'s death, his mother remarried. Robert Jr. was not happy about this at all. He resented his stepdad. By all means, he was totally against his mom getting remarried after being widowed. And so he totally thought this should not happen. He kind of resented her as because of this marriage. And so he even became more withdrawn from society, more withdrawn from people at this time. He would immerse himself into such activities that he's always had a liking towards, like art. He really liked art as a child, and that was something that he did. And so what he started doing was he started having these pen pals. And so he would write to them in countries such as Vietnam, and then he would have them send them a stamp. Okay, a stamp. That way he'd have a little collection of stamps around the world. His drive towards art. He would have photographs of mythical and historical icons, ancient cultures, and architect that would lead to his developing interest in primitive art. That's where he started really focusing on. So he started, you know, getting into that and photographs and antiques. So from approximately 1965, he would start collecting a lot of these artifacts, and this would later inspire him to open his own business in 1982. And I will get into that business that he started a little later in this episode. In 1967, he graduated from Cuyahoga Falls High School, and that's where, you know, shortly after graduation, right around 1966, he enrolled in Kansas City Art Institute with aspirations of becoming a college professor. So he's thinking he wants to become a professor down the road. His first year at the Art Institute, you know, people were saying he was attentive. He was considered attentive and talented student. But by the second year, things started going a little south. And he started making his own adult mistakes that would stay with him. And in his second year, that's also when he started becoming, he became friends with particular students who were quite not the greatest students. They were into drugs. They were supplying him with drugs that he would turn around and sell to other students on campus at a profit. And so other students they started referring to him as a drug dealer. So along with the drugs, he started abusing alcohol as well. And he started engaging in animal torture on at least 3 different occasions while a student at the Kansas City Art Institute. During 2 of these instances, he tortured a duck and a chicken in the presence of his peers. So they gave eyewitness testimony to what he did there. And in the 3rd instance, he experimented with sedatives and tranquilizers on a dog. When he was 19, he was arrested for attempting to sell methamphetamines to an undercover officer. He was released and he pleaded guilty to a 5-year suspended sentence. That way he didn't have to serve any jail time at that moment by pleading guilty and receiving the suspended sentence. Now, 1 month after his first arrest, he was then arrested again with some of his friends for possession of marijuana and LSD. Now, this time he could not post any bond, and so he had to stay in jail for 5 days. Now, granted, one of the charges would not stick because they didn't have enough evidence against him. In 1969, Berdella voluntarily withdrew from the Kansas City Art Institute after receiving a lot of backlash from the administrative people there at the college for killing and cooking a duck in the name of art. He said he did this for art reasons because he believed that was an artistic thing to do. Now, he would stay in the Kansas City area, and he would actually move into an address within Hyde Park. And within Hyde Park is where he moved into 4315 Charlotte Street. And that is that home, 4315 Charlotte Street. And that's when he would move into this home that he would create a torture chamber within the home. And that's where a lot of the crimes would begin. But it's interesting, before we actually get into the killing, some of the things that he actually did. Okay? So now at this point, he had been openly gay for several years. And he began spending much time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, petty criminals, and even runaways. People that would obviously have their own world of baggage, and he would be a part of it. And some thought he was trying to help some of them try to get back on their feet. And so he would befriend them, and he would try to help them from their drug addiction and things like that. And, try to help them get away from their criminal lifestyles. And he said throughout much of 1970s, he didn't have any physical contact with any of these people that he was trying to help. None of the druggies, none of the runaways. He was just trying to help them get back on their feet. That's what he shared about the 1970s as he was having other people coming into the home. And to several of the neighbors, Berdella stated that he almost felt like a foster parent to many of them that were staying there. Now, by the 1980s, more of his older acquaintances no longer had anything to do with him. He was becoming too reliant on them for having a social lifestyle. And, to relying on them for their companionship, for their friendship. He would even claim to become increasingly frustrated at many times because of their ignorance of his efforts to help them. Now, with many of the people that he was helping in the 80s, that's when he started having sexual intercourse with some of them. He would try to buy their affection, basically, buy their trust. What he would do is he would establish a degree of control over them. Maybe he would give them money or even let them live rent-free at his house for periods of time. And it was interesting because beginning in the late 70s, Robert would assist in the organizational activities of the South Hyde Park crime prevention community. And so he would try to help them create a safer neighborhood in the early 1980s. He would even encourage neighborhood watch nights and have patrols of having the community members on patrol to keep the neighborhood safe. He would help lead this. Now, by the mid-1980s, he started getting away from that. He would get away from the fundraising stuff that he was helping with, and all the events that they were doing. He was a part of those in the 70s, but by the mid-80s, he was distancing himself away from that. Now, because at the age of 19, when he accrued all these charges, he would have to pay the lawyer fees, because there was a lot of lawyer fees to help him get out of this mess that he got himself into. And so he started cooking. He started as a part-time chef, and then it became a full-time chef, and it became part of something he actually enjoyed doing. And so he would be a short order cook in various restaurants in the Kansas City area. And, you know, as part of trying to come up with money and the side gigs, as I mentioned earlier, he was collecting a lot of artifacts around the world. And so what he started doing, you know, since he was getting contacts from Africa, Asia, South America, you know, various Pacific Rim countries, he started getting collectibles. And so what he would do is he created a side business from home. And so his career as a cook and his side business actually started taking off. And by the mid-1970s, Berdella began working as a senior cook at several well-known Kansas City restaurants. He even established a training program for aspiring chefs, and he started joining local chefs associations, you know, as part of that whole group. Now, even though he was doing this all for chefs and he was enjoying being a cook, his business, his actual business, his little side business where he was collecting artifacts, antiques, and things like that, really started to take off. So then he realized he should go all in with that business as opposed to working as a chef. Now, granted, he did like working as a chef, but this was his opportunity to own his own business. So by 1981, he had established several contractual agreements, both national and international, with contacts that he started having for his own business. So he viewed this as a business as his full-time job and gave up being a chef. And so in 1982, he would move on to other things, and he focused all in on his business, and he called it Bob's Bazaar. Now, isn't that bizarre? So by 1982, or should I say in 1982, he began renting his own booth at the Westport Flea Market there in Kansas City. And he named the store Bob's Bazaar. And he primarily sold and traded primitive art, jewelry, and antiques. Now, although he would occasionally make a great monthly profit, it wasn't consistent. And so some months he was not making money. Some months he had too many expenses, and so he had to be creative on how he was going to come up with products. And so as a result of not having a profit, he would have to come up with ways. And so what he would do is he started selling goods to fellow merchants right there in the flea market at a financial loss, just to get rid of it and to bring money in. Or, you know, sometimes he would even steal 4 items to sell at his booth. And sometimes he would even put people up in his home as a way to bring in a little rent to help pay his bills. Now, at his work right there at the Westport Flea Market, he became acquainted with a fellow merchant. His name was Paul Howell. And Paul, he operated a booth as well right there of his own. Now soon, Berdella became acquainted with Paul's younger son, Jerry Howell. And this name is very important to what he does here coming up. And so now Jerry and his friends used to make fun of Robert Berdella. They would make fun of him because he was so open about his homosexuality. And so Jerry would actually, and his friends would actually make fun of him being so open about it. And according to Robert, he would share this with the police, that Jerry later confided in him that he and his friends would resort to male prostitution as a way to earn money. Now, by the early 1980s, Paul Howell would relocate his store. And he would relocate it away from the Westport Flea Market to a store within a building close to the intersection of 39th and Main Street. Now, above there were apartments, and so Jerry and his family, Jerry and Paul and his family would live on top of the store. Now, even though Jerry Howell and Robert Berdella would have some arguments on occasion, they would actually become casual friends and they would hang out. And Robert would even offer, like, hey, Jerry, if you get into trouble and you need financial help, I'll assist you, if you need any financial help at all. By the summer of 1984, Jerry Howell turns 19. Okay, so now he is past 18 and he's older. And this is where we get deeper. And this is how we get to what would later lead to police investigating his home and even found a skull that was buried in there. And this is where a lot would start coming to light. And so now we're going to share with you the victims at the hands of Robert Berdella. And thanks to Christopher Bryson getting away and being able to start this whole process when it did. Because again, who knows how long this was going to continue. And that's exactly where we're going to focus on. Because I always want to share who are the victims that were taken way too early. And I'll share with you the sad story behind each of these victims that died at the hands of the Kansas City Butcher. We start with none other. Who do you suppose was the first victim of this heinous man? That's right. It was the murder of Jerry Howell. Jerry Howell was the son of Paul Howell, who was a merchant at the flea market, where he owned his own booth as well. And Jerry was 19 years old, and he was a male prostitute, as I mentioned earlier, according to Robert Berdella. He was the son of Paul, and they shared time at the Westport flea market. So he was actually an acquaintance of Jerry Howell. They were friends, kind of. They hung out. Robert would tell him, like, hey, if you get into problems and you need any financial help with legal stuff, I will help you. And so the night of July 4th, 1984, Berdella picked up Jerry because he promised him to take him to a local dance. And when I say local, this was in Merriam, Kansas, which was also part of the Kansas City metropolitan area. And so he picked them up, and guess what? Jerry would never be seen alive again. And it is possible that Berdella targeted Jerry not only because the two had a sexual relationship, but also because the youth owed the older man money because of helping him out. Now, we don't know if this was the actual true cause of the murder, whether it was lust or financial or just something he's been holding on to and wanting to let go, because it was kind of in him, wasn't it? So Berdella invited Powell into his home on Charlotte Street, which is the famous house, and he began handing him drinks. Now, these drinks were spiked with tranquilizers, so he's going to be passing out. And so for at least 28 hours, Berdella kept Powell drugged and tied to a bed. And Robert repeatedly raped and assaulted the young man. Now, these sexual assaults included the use of objects like a metal pole, a carrot, and a cucumber. It's really sick. Now, Jerry would die after suffocating on his gag. It could be the cocktail of drugs that Berdella gave him, and he died choking on his own vomit. And so what's Robert going to do after that? Well, he's going to begin the horrific way of disposing of the body. He hung Powell's corpse by its feet, and he slit his jugular vein in order to drain his blood. This is sick. And then used kitchen knives and a chainsaw to hack Powell up into smaller pieces. These body parts were then placed into trash bags and left outside for the garbage crew to pick it up. I don't understand how this has never come into light beforehand. And so that's the murder of Jerry Howell, his very first victim. That's the murder of Jerry Howell. Rest in peace, Jerry. The next victim of this heinous crime is Robert Sheldon. On April 10, 1985, a 23-year-old drifter, Robert Sheldon, showed up at Berdella's doorstep. Now, the two men knew each other. That's why Robert went over there, right? Because in the past, Robert would show up needing a place to stay whenever he was passing through Kansas City. So he would stay at Berdella's house. On the day in question, Sheldon once again showed up and asked to stay. Robert agreed. Now, because Berdella was not sexually attracted to him, he tortured him, but he didn't rape him. And the torture sessions lasted a total of 4 days. Sheldon was subjected to some grotesque ways of torture. For example, he had his hands bound with piano wire in an attempt to destroy his nerves. And Berdella also put caulk in Sheldon's ears and injected cleaning fluid into Sheldon's left eye. Now, by the 4th day, Berdella started to get a little worried that maybe his neighbors saw Sheldon come over and start wondering of his whereabouts. And so Robert decided to end it all by using a trash bag to suffocate him. And just like Jerry Powell, his corpse was mutilated and dismembered the same way. But the difference between Sheldon and Powell is that Berdella decapitated Sheldon and put his head in the house's freezer. So he held on to the head for a little while. Rest in peace, Robert Sheldon. Of all of Berdella's murders, the 1985 slaying of Mark Wallace is the least well documented. So he didn't take many notes on this particular one. But Berdella openly admitted to killing the young man in his 1988 trial. And from this confession, it is obvious that Berdella spent less time on Wallace's torture and murder than he did on the others. Now, according to the book Rites of Burial by Tom Jackman and Troy Cole, Wallace had previously done some yard work for Berdella. That's how they knew each other. And that's why Wallace was looking for some shelter in Berdella's garage during a June thunderstorm. Berdella found the youth and invited him inside the house, and the 20-year-old Wallace agreed. Once inside, Wallace, who he suffered a lot from depression, and so he was injected with this drug, and that's where the heinous crime would really begin when it came against Wallace. And so Berdella exploited Wallace's drugged state by tying him to a bed. The torture of Wallace included a crude form of electroshock therapy, whereby Berdella placed alligator clips on Wallace's nipples and administered occasional shocks. At 7 p.m. on June 23rd, 1985, Wallace expired from a combination of the drugs, his gag, and Berdella's vicious use of hypodermic needle, which has been inserted into Wallace's back in an effort to ruin the muscles there. Rest in peace, Mark Wallace. And so now let's talk about the murder of Walter James Ferris, another victim to this heinous crime. So on September 26, 1985, an acquaintance by the name Walter James Ferris called Berdella and asked if he could stay for a while. Not long after Ferris arrived at the house on Charlotte Street, Berdella captured him, tied him up, and began torturing him. One of the cruel methods that Berdella used on Ferris was to attach alligator clips to Ferris's testicles and shoot him full of 7,700 volts of electricity. Terrible, terrible. The abuse was so bad that near the end of Ferris's life, he could only remain conscious between 10 and 15 seconds at a time. Now, once Ferris's condition deteriorated, Berdella decided to suffocate him and end it all for him. Now, Ferris's corpse was dismembered like the others and casually discarded in trash bags. Rest in peace, Walter James Ferris. The next murder, TODD Stoops. Now, TODD Stoops, his whole tragic story began on June 17, 1986. On that day, Stoops, who also was a male prostitute who had known Berdella for many years, decided to accompany Berdella back to Charlotte Street house after the pair met at a local park. Now, Stoops just thought he was going to join Berdella for lunch. Berdella drugged Stoops and held him captive for weeks. Stoops was raped daily and subjected to different experiments, all of which were intended to turn him into a sex slave. Besides electroshots, Berdella injected drain cleaner into Stoops' throat in a failed attempt to make him mute. He even injected Drano into Stoops' eyes to make him blind. The final debauched act saw Berdella insert his fist into Stoops' anal cavity. After this, Stoops died of blood loss and septic shock. And this is all so gruesome. Before disposing of Stoops' corpse in the usual manner, Berdella kept the body down in the basement for at least a week. Now, Berdella would admit that he found Stoops attractive, and this might explain why Stoops was tortured so much and why his corpse was kept around instead of mutilated and tossed in the trash bags like some of the other ones. Rest in peace, TODD Stoops. Now, the last murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. Now, Larry was 20 years old, and he had met Berdella at the serial killer's store, that Bob's Bazaar. And Pearson, who was originally from Wichita, Kansas, supposedly had talked to Berdella about magic and witchcraft. Now, Berdella was one that had roomed with Pearson, was one that had roomed with Berdella for a while, doing housework and odd tasks for Berdella in exchange for rent money. But on June 5th, 1987, Berdella paid Pearson's bail and invited him to live again at the Charlotte Street house. On June 23rd, Berdella began drugging, raping, and torturing Pearson. This torture session would last for 6 weeks. After a while, Pearson began fighting back. Pearson's most effective attack actually sent Berdella to the hospital. Specifically, Pearson managed to bite Berdella's penis, and this would put the serial killer in the hospital for 2 days. Way to go, Pearson. Berdella managed to suffocate Pearson before going to the hospital. However, Berdella used a plastic bag to render Pearson's lifeless and then dismembered and decapitated Pearson's body. Now, detaching his head, guess what he would do with that? He would bury it in his backyard. This bit of excavation exposed Robert Sheldon's fleshless skull, and so Berdella brought the skull back inside the house and put it on display. So this was one of the skulls that they found there. Rest in peace, Larry Wayne Pearson. Now this is where Berdella picked the wrong guy, and you would even find a little of his lighter side where he started feeling for this guy. Okay, this is the attempted murder of Christopher Bryson. Easter weekend 1988, a bizarre phone call reached the Kansas City police. Someone who lived on Charlotte Street said that there was a naked man wearing a dog collar in the neighborhood. When the police found the man, they were shocked to see that he had been abused horribly. They could see there were visible signs that this guy was just tortured, hurt in many, many ways. Christopher could barely talk. His eyes were red and bruised, and his body was a mess of scars and cuts. Now, some of these wounds came from him leaping out of the second floor house at 4315 Charlotte Street, and the man proved to be the 22-year-old Christopher Bryson, who also was a male prostitute. Bryson told investigators that a man driving a brown Toyota had picked him up near midnight on March 29th, 1988. And Bryson was taken to the man's house, where he was quickly hit upside the head with a metal bar and bound with rope. The homeowner, Berdella, also used a needle to inject some kind of drug into Bryson's back. Berdella gagged Bryson, shocked his testicles with electricity, and swabbed his eyes with ammonia. Berdella told Bryson that he was going to become a sex slave to Berdella. Now, Bryson, he decides to cooperate in order to avoid further injury. And Bryson managed to convince Berdella to tie his hands in front of him rather than to the bed. Berdella agreed to this. Unbeknownst to Berdella, Bryson was left in a room with a box of matches. Bryson used these matches to burn through his ropes. Bryson's final act was the jump from the bedroom window. Police inundated Berdella's house and arrested him for the assault and torture of Bryson. Days later, once he was presented with all the evidence, Berdella pleaded guilty to murder. And it was interesting because, Bryson jumps from the second store window, and it might even been a parking attendant who also called this in. Multiple people called this in. And it might even been the parking attendant who saw him as well when he ran away and, hey, what's going on? So police hurried to this location. Berdella wasn't home yet. While police were on scene, Berdella arrives home. And that's where he is quickly questioned. Great job, Christopher Bryson, being smart, maintaining your wits about you before it was too late. Good job. And I'm happy because you helped get this guy sooner than later. So, of course, there's going to be a trial. After Berdella gave the court a full confession, the Jackson County prosecutor agreed to Berdella's request for a life sentence rather than death sentence. So obviously he was scared to die, but he wasn't scared to take others' lives. How ironic is that? And so the prosecutor agreed, give us all of the information. We will give you a life sentence rather than a death sentence, because he was definitely going to get the death sentence. And the trial lasted 3 days. Berdella was then sent away to the Missouri Penitentiary in Jefferson City. The prison guards and, Berdella proved to be a difficult prisoner. He wrote dozens of letters to the prison officials of abuse. In particular, Berdella claimed that the prison authorities were keeping his medication away from him. Again, it's interesting because Berdella clearly doesn't want to die. I'm going to share an interview with you, and this is the only interview he has done after being captured. And he did this with a local news company there in Kansas City area. And so listen up. It's about 7 minutes long, and it's going to follow all the way through till him dying in prison.
Was that you kept detailed torture logs and diaries. Did you?
I kept sheets of paper that I had made some notations on. This is between the mattress and springs on my bed. This is one of those packages containing numerous photographs and what became to be known as meticulous, methodical diaries. Those pieces of paper in there are these meticulous diaries.
These are the pictures of the more than 200 photographs, some of them of young men, sexual partners, and these are in some ways, and these that we see here are the sheets of paper upon which you made notes.
Right.
See.
This is a copy of one of those pages.
It looks like a loose leaf paper. It does contain information about amounts of drugs and so on. So what is your complaint with the police calling these detailed diaries?
By your evaluation, does this look methodical?
Doesn't look methodical.
Meticulous?
It looks a little sloppy.
They are not bound in Corinthian leather, written on parchment diaries that the media apparently tries to describe them as. The sheets of paper.
How do you feel when you learned that not long after your arrest, the local radio stations, 2 of them at least, were running a Bob Berdella parody song and were asking people to come to parties wearing dog collars?
Well, I think the newspaper article reported that even the families of the victims were upset by the song. I have never had a chance to hear the song. I had also been told when I first came into jail that the Fox radio station had run a promo giving prizes to their listeners if they showed up at the station in a dog collar and with a leash on. The people here in the institution, the correctional officers, the caseworker, even the psychiatrist, were, I think, surprised to find out that that upset me.
And it did upset you?
Very much so.
You recall we mentioned before that there were reports in the Westport flea market where you had your shop that people would say, oh yes, I do remember he had these strange smelling dishes of food, that he had bead bones. And later on there was speculation, at least in the community and in some aspects of the media, that the remains of your victim were somehow being transported and prepared as meals and prepared as jewelry in your shop.
I was quickly able to identify to the police the other dealers in that section of the market where we rotated potluck rather than eat the flea market food again. And that you could question any of these people and they'd be able to tell you that the food was good. There was nothing suspect about the turkey or ham or beef that was in these dishes.
I want the police to explain why they allow the loved ones of families to die in the convenient area of 10th and McGee.
I don't think any family of my victims or anybody else that has been killed down related to 10th and McGee are going to be happy to find out that their loved one is basically written off by the police as far as investigations go, etc., because they died in a convenient neighborhood. The police knew what was going on, so it's no big deal.
And that accounts for your remark to me, and I don't mean at all to make light of it, that I killed 6, but they, the police, by allowing this to stay open, they killed more.
Yes. This has been something that's been going on for over 20 years, to my knowledge.
It seems to me that you're suggesting that had the police done their job, had they followed the leads, had they really been on your case prior to April 2nd, 1988, they would have caught you, and some of this suffering could have been prevented.
Maybe not caught me. Scared me off, maybe. Prevented things from happening after HOWELL? Definitely.
In a way, do you wish they had? There was a report
Yes.
in the Sunday Kansas City Star in December about the dangers you might face after you leave the Jackson County Correction Facility and are moved to another larger prison. How do you feel about reports like that? Do they make you anxious?
They give me some reason for concern, but one of the reasons I'm concerned is it These were not just reports. These were digging out quotes from unnamed prosecutors implying that the inmates down there are waiting to get their hands on me. I am at this point am less concerned about the inmates acting on their own as opposed to the inmates or an inmate acting in response to maybe some directive or coercion from some police officers.
Do you think you're being set up, perhaps?
Well, I think the Star and Times have, since they haven't been able to get a court to put me to death, are now trying to get the inmates to do it for them.
Just a bunch of earth is all that's left of 4315 Charlotte. But some people will never forget the house nor the man who lived here. Bob Berdella, Kansas City's most infamous serial killer, is dead. He died in prison after his victims were killed in his home. Berdella confessed to sexually and physically torturing 6 men here. But some believe there were more victims and hope digging up the house might unearth some secrets. That's why millionaire Dell Dunmeyer, who owns the property, had workers carefully tear it down. Private Detective Ashley Hearn was here in 1988 when the truth came out, and he's been here for the past 5 weeks, making sure no other bodies turned up. He says the stairs to the basement will be saved, as well as this drain, reportedly used to carry away the blood of Berdella's victims. Well, this appears to be the final chapter of the Berdella story, and no one could be happier than those who live on either side, who will split the property.
There you have it, my friends. That's the story of Robert Berdella, the Kansas City butcher, also known as the Collector. Let me know in the comments what you think about this story. Do you think that there's more victims than just the 6? I personally think there is only 6. I feel like he started having a little remorse at the end. Granted, there's no excuse for what he's doing, but I think that he tried to come clean about everything that went on in order to avoid the death penalty. What else does he have to lose, right? He was never going to see the light of day again. And before his death, he was complaining that they were not giving him his heart medicine and he would die of a heart attack. And so let me know what you think of this story. And hey, be sure to smash that subscribe button so you get notified when I upload more content. At the end of the day, as you can tell, I want to go deep in true crime and I want to share with you the ins and outs. And that's why I shared each of these deaths and even the gruesome details, because I'm going deep in true crime. I'm Manny Rodriguez and I look forward to serving you with some more video content around true crime. Have a great day. Take care.